work for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and sometimes people know who the Wildlife Resources Commission is, but not always. So has anybody heard of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission before? Awesome. So tell me what they do, or who we are, or what we might be responsible for. Wildlife. That's exactly right. Sometimes we don't even get that, so that's a great response. So what related to wildlife do you think we would be responsible for in the state?
Preservation.
Yeah, preservation.
Protection.
All of those things, yep. So in the 40s, we were formed as a state agency to establish and monitor a hunting and fishing license system. Prior to that, we didn't really have anything that allowed us to know how many people were harvesting animals, in what ways, and at what times. So being able to form that kind of originally was meant to be self-sustaining. Our license sales come back into our agency only. That's a federal mandate for a Fish and Wildlife Agency, and it allowed us for a long time to be able to sustain ourselves with a little bit of extra money, but for the most part. And so that is still the case today, that the hunting and fishing license sales come back to us. And what they get used for today is to help with our enforcement officers, their pay, their equipment, their training, all of that. And we have, gosh, I forget how many across the state, 100 plus, I think. It's not as many as we need, but a couple in each county, or a couple of county. We also use the license sale money for research on game animals. So the game animals are the ones that you can hunt and fish and trap. And we have biologists surveying those wildlife, the habitats they use, trying to make sure that the regulations that we set up are what they need to be for science, for management's sake. We have hunting and fishing for the purpose of the public to have that opportunity, but we also want to make sure that we're making those regulations as far as what is sound science, not just what the public wants. That's definitely part of it, but we need to make sure that we're doing what's right for wildlife in North Carolina. That's ultimately our responsibility. So we have biologists who do that. We also have an education program, and the education program is partially funded by license sale monies. So even if you don't hunt and fish, we sometimes have people buy licenses just to be able to support education. You can also directly support some of our programs. So the Pisgah Center for Wildlife Education, that's in Pisgah National Forest. I have a brochure over there if you want to know some of the programs they're offering. You can just donate specifically to education, but sometimes people will do that and donate through license sale monies. But we also have all kinds of wildlife in North Carolina that are not game animals. Bats are one of them. So we have non-game biologists, and their funding doesn't typically come from license sale money, so they have to find funding in other ways. Check off for wildlife on your taxes specifically goes to non-game research. Our license plate, that goes to non-game research. We have a plan called the Wildlife Action Plan. It's a very, very large 500 plus page document that explains how we're going to prioritize research. And any state that develops that kind of plan has access to state wildlife grants that are also kind of federally mandated. And that is also money we bring in. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provides grants as well. So there are multiple ways that each of our programs within our agency get funded. Very little of it is state tax dollars. So there's an excise tax if you buy hunting and fishing equipment that comes back to us, that tax specifically. But as far as just general state tax dollars, we get very little of the money. It used to be allocated based on motor boat taxes, the gas taxes on motor boats, because we also manage boating. And that has been shifted around in the last handful of years. So there's just a small amount of normal state tax dollars that get budgeted to us, even though we're considered a state agency. And you're taxpayers, so you should know where your money's going. Which is why I mentioned that. The last part of our agency I want to mention real quick before we get started is we have an engineering division, and they build accesses to public waters, among other things. We also have game lands that we manage or own, and those are public properties, and they manage those as well. So if you've been to a public boat ramp or pier, any sort of access to public waters, you'll often see our diamond logo, or should see our diamond logo somewhere on that property, and that lets you know that that's an access that we build and maintain. And we get a combination of some federal dollars and our license sales monies that help pay for those accesses. So if you want to use those, that's part of the Commission's responsibility, is to give you that opportunity. All right, so related to bats, just to kind of give you a general idea of what I'm going to talk about, and that way if you have questions, you're certainly welcome to ask them at any point. I never remember the question if I wait till the end of the presentation, so I don't expect you to have to wait either, so just jump in and ask me. But these are the general topics I'm going to cover in this short amount of time. Just some basic bat biology, just to kind of give you a little bit of information about bats, and specifically talk about white nose syndrome. How many of you guys have heard of white nose syndrome before? Awesome, this is an exceptional crowd. That's not always the case. So a little bit of updates on white nose syndrome, and then some of the North Carolina projects we have going on with bats right now, and ways that you can get involved. So this may be stuff you already know, but in case you don't, bats are a mammal, and they're our only true flying mammal. We have flying squirrels who glide but cannot actually fly. So they're our only true flying mammal. They're the most diverse group of mammals. About a quarter of all mammal species are bats, which is pretty awesome. So over potentially 12 or 1,300 species, depending on what research you are using as a reference, it varies a little bit. And we have around 17 species in North Carolina. Many of those are in Western North Carolina. As with most other things, it's pretty amazing, the biodiversity in Western North Carolina, which I'm sure you know, and bats are no exception. So just to show you some of that diversity, we only have one of these species. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. All the other species are found in different parts of the world, but you can see how very different they look. Some faces only a mother would love, but still pretty amazing. So they are in an order called Chiroptera, and that just means hand wing. So that gives you some idea of the anatomy of their ability to fly. It's just a big elongated hand, elongated fingers, and they have skin over it, and that allows them to fly. The really cool thing about that is, unlike birds, whose wing structure is a little bit different, bats have way more maneuverability than birds do, and the nice thing about that is they're catching bugs who also have amazing maneuverability in the air, so it works pretty well for them. But all the same bones that we have, just different lengths. But thumb, all the fingers, radius, ulna, humerus, all of that is similar to our arms and hands. And just to give you some idea of the different types of foods they eat, most all bat species eat insects. But there are, and then the next largest are the fruit-eating bats. We don't have any of those in North Carolina, but they're the bigger bats, longer faces. You've probably seen, I don't know if you've seen videos or books, but eating grapes, super cute, or figs. They've got mouth full of fruit, you know, they're really cute faces. There are also a large number of nectar-eating bats. And then we have a few bats. There are 3 species of the vampire bats who do drink blood. They don't stab you in the neck and suck your blood, but they do make a scrape on a large animal like a horse or a cow and lap up the blood. Pretty amazing bats if you want to do a little research. Pretty awesome. There are some fish-eating bats and other meat-eating bats, frogs, eating frogs and other things like that, lizards, etc. All of the bat species that we have in North Carolina are insect-eating bats. And some general information about their reproduction. Here is a red bat. That's the mom, and there's a pup, and there's a pup. So they're very big. They're almost 40%, could be up to 40%, a quarter to 40% of their mother's weight. I think it's something like us giving birth to a 28-pound baby or something. It's pretty crazy, pretty miserable sounding. And fertilization is internal. The average gestation for most bats is 2 months. For some of the vampire bats, it's much longer, but 2 months is pretty normal. And they have an amazing strategy of mating when it's convenient and giving birth when it's convenient. So they mate in the fall. That's when everybody is at their healthiest and able to get around. Weather's great, insects are great. And, but they don't want to give birth in the dead of winter. So they just delay fertilization, so the females are able to store the sperm, and then delay the fertilization till late winter, and then the pups are born in the spring. Other animals do similar strategies. Bears can delay fertilization in a little bit different way, but the concept is the same. Mate when it's convenient to mate, when everybody's at their healthiest, and then give birth when it makes sense and is safest. So pretty amazing strategy. And then for some of the bats, I'll call them tree bats. We have some bats who primarily use caves and mines to roost, and then we have some bats who never use caves and mines, and they are primarily using trees. And this red bat is one of the tree bats. They're more heavily furred, and they're solitary, and they often will carry their pups with them, because bats who are using mines and caves often have maternity colonies where they take care of each other's babies and take turns, the moms take turns going to feed. But tree bats don't, and so it's much riskier to leave their young in the tree by themselves, so they just take them with them and lug them around. They do echolocate, which you may know that information, but the bats who are needing to eat bugs do that by sending a series of sounds out through their mouth or nose, and then when it hits something solid, it bounces back. Other animals do this as well, whales, for example, dolphins. And the nice thing about that is they can be out when there's not a lot of light. Right? So the bugs are out in the evening. It makes sense to be flying around in the evening, but it's just a little bit harder to see because it's nighttime and they don't have monster eyes like owls do. So they use echolocation instead. So it's not that they're blind, it just is a better way to find bugs than looking for them. So they use echolocation instead. Often they're at pitches that we can't hear. They're pretty good at it because they're not flying around running into buildings. So we get nervous about bats flying over us when we're out in the evening or in the pool, but it's not because they're interested in us, they're not going to miss and hit us. It's because the bugs are attracted to us and they're attracted to the bugs. So they're trying to help us out. So other bats we call mega bats, which are the bats who are not insect eating, the one with the long noses. We call them fruit bats or flying foxes. They are eating fruit and nectar, so they need to see that. So they are not needing to echolocate. It's the middle of the day and they can see well and the fruit is big, or they can smell the nectar. So they're not echolocating, they're just looking for their food. But the microbats, the one with the smaller eyes, I'll show you some here in a second, that are the bats we have, they are echolocating because they're looking for bugs at night. And our bats are either hibernating or migrating. And so in the wintertime, there aren't any bugs to eat. You've either got to figure out how to hunker down and save energy, or you've got to figure out how to move to where there is food. And so many of our bats, those cave bats that I was talking about, are often, and even some of the tree bats, they are needing to find a place where they can lower their body temperature, because that saves energy, and find a place out of the weather to be safe, and then hang out for the winter without eating for the most part, or at least not eating very often. And so their body temperature goes from about 100 degrees to 40 or 50 degrees. And this is where white nose syndrome is such a problem. So I'll talk about that again in a second. But I mean, they're pretty much just barely alive when they're hibernating. And their heartbeat significantly slows. Their metabolism is nothing, for the most part. Their immune system is tanked at that point. They're just doing enough to stay alive. And then facultative heterotherm just means that they've got to be able to warm up to then be able to fly around. So it's kind of an intentional warming their body back up, which burns energy, and then be able to fly around. So there's got to be a reason for doing that, because if you do that too many times, you would die of starvation because you run out of your energy stores. And so just a few of the bat species in North Carolina, just so some of the names might become familiar to you if you hear them in the news or read about them. The Indiana bat and the gray bat and the Virginia big-eared bat are 3 species that are federally endangered here, or are federally endangered but live here in western North Carolina. And federally threatened, the northern long-eared, if you've heard in the news recently, we just recently were able to get that one listed, and that is white nose syndrome mostly that impacted that. It was not doing fantastically prior to that, but white nose syndrome has hit it really hard, and so we were able to get it listed pretty quickly. The eastern small-footed bat is a state special concern species, and the southeastern bat as well. And then the Raffinesque big-eared bat, which is a subspecies of Virginia big-eared bat, is also state threatened. And you know, you think about echolocating, if you see these big ears, real big ears, that's perfect, right? Because you want that sound to come back and you know, you really want to be able to capture it. So you might also see on some bat species these crazy things on their faces, all bumpy and gnarly and wavy and all kinds of skin. That is also to receive that sound. So our microbats, the insect-eating bats, have big ears and often some sort of nose leaf, wrinkly something on their face. That's all helping them receive that sound. And then a few of the other species, the big brown bat and the little brown bat. I guess they got named first, and then everybody else had to be something different. And then the tricolored bat, which also used to be called the pipistrelle bat, if you'd ever heard that name. I kind of like that better than tricolored, but if you have been to Linville Caverns and you see tiny little bats kind of hanging out solo, you know, in the cave there, those are the tricolored bats. They're teeny tiny and yet do not like to cluster. Like some of the coldest parts of the caves, it's the craziest thing that they're just these little, you know, such tolerant bats. Little brown bats have been one of our most common species, but are getting hit almost probably harder than any, or as hard as our other species, so they might eventually become one of our least common species because they're just getting annihilated. So a little bit of information about white nose syndrome, and then we're going to get positive again. So hang on, because it sounds really terrible. So there's a cold-loving fungus, and it has a really long name, Pseudogymnoascus destructans. You might just see PD for short, because that's just not a name you want to roll off your tongue very often. And we think since it was first discovered in 2006 that there are somewhere between 6 and 7 million bats that have been killed. Usually when the biologists are going into a cave, in the wintertime is when they do the cave surveys, because that's when bats are hibernating, they are finding 95 to 100% mortality in the cave. And we have 31 states now that have confirmed white nose syndrome in their state, and 5 Canadian provinces. It seems to affect only cave species. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But not all cave species, which is the real positive that we have. So here's a little bit more about Western North Carolina. We basically know it's in every county in Western North Carolina. We don't need to send off every single test anymore because we know it's here. We have sent off a lot of the samples, and we are continuing to see, we found it in North Carolina in 2010-11, the winter 2010 or 11. And since then, all of our survey methods, and you'll learn the different ways that we survey bats, all of them are showing a decline, a continued decline for tricolored, Indiana, northern long-eared, and little brown. And we now have confirmed the Piedmont counties. Yes?
If 5% or so survive or are not affected, is there any indication that they're developing
a resistance? Yes, it seems to be. And it may be on one of the slides here, but because it was first found in New York in 2006, we're 11 years out from that, they are starting to level off. So it's not just continuing to decline, which is something, there's something to be said for that. And it's not just those tree species that are not susceptible. It seems to be that these cave species who also seem to have a natural resistance to it are then the ones reproducing, and then it would seem that their young maybe have a resistance to it. Somebody's reproducing and the numbers are kind of leveling out. They're not certainly as high as they were prior to white nose syndrome, but they're not continuing to drop. So that seems to be what they're doing, and a lot of the research is focused on those bats who have the resistance and figuring out what it is about it. And one of the things that we're seeing in North Carolina is some of these bat species that are also found at the coast, the northern long-eareds, for example, because they're more active in the winter, because there are insects out in the winter, the climate is so much milder, they might not be impacted by white nose syndrome because they're just not dropping their temperature, their immune system isn't tanked, they're not in the cave where the cold-loving fungus really needs to be. One of the reasons white nose syndrome is impacting them is because their body temperature drops to 40 or 50. And it's a cold-loving fungus, so it's growing in their skin, on their skin, in their skin, and really doing some damage to their system. So if it's at the coast, and even if they're coming and going out of a cave, they seem to not be hibernating or hibernating as long. Maybe that's a potential positive for the species that, even though they're also in Western North Carolina, might not be impacted at the coast. So you will often see, you might have seen it in that first picture, they have a white fungus that grows on their nose and on their wings and tail membrane, wing membrane, etc. You don't always see that because bats will wake up and then clean themselves. So it's potential that you're not going to see it just by the, you're not going to know it's white nose syndrome just by the mold look that's growing on them. It does damage their wing membrane because it gets into their tissue and then just starts to eat away and grow and kind of wreak havoc. It depletes their body fat and they are getting dehydrated because part of what's happening is it's throwing off the physiology in their system. They get dehydrated, they wake up because they're dehydrated, which they would normally do throughout the winter, just not often. So it's just kind of speeding up their need to wake up and try to find water, and which means they just deplete those fat stores quicker, throws off their pH and just kind of wreaks havoc on their system.
Well, then do bats migrate, like if they are in New York, do they?
Part of what's spreading white nose syndrome is bats are moving from cave to cave. So yes, bats do migrate. They don't move north to south like birds do specifically. They just move to a better place, whichever direction that might be. Some bat species are very specific to only a handful of caves and come back to the same ones every winter. But other bats are a little more flexible and will move, from cave to cave.
Well, like if we were in Carlsbad, down in that's warm enough.
The problem is caves tend to be the same temperature no matter where they're found. So, even in Florida, the cave temperature is still in the 50s. Western North Carolina is still in the 50s. So even though the outside climate might be much warmer, the cave climate is still the same.
What is the pattern of the disease?
Spreading west. You're going to see a map.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep. So in Western North Carolina, these 9 species, not in Western North Carolina. These are the 9 species in the United States and Canada that are affected by white nose syndrome. And all but the Yuma bat we have in North Carolina. The southeastern bat is a coastal species, but the other 7 are Western North Carolina. And you can see that some of those are endangered bats. And then, here's a positive note, there are species where the fungus has been confirmed on them. We swab the bats and then send that off, but they have not shown signs of the disease infecting their tissue. So even having the fungus on them, some seem to have this resistance where all the conditions are right for them to develop the symptoms of white nose syndrome, but they're not. And these are the bats we're really trying to figure out what is it that they have that the other ones don't have. The red bat is a tree bat. So that's one of the bats that is not using caves. But these other ones are using caves. And some of them, like the Townsends and the Virginia, they're pretty specific to only a handful of caves. And so they're seeing the same, they're getting exposed to white nose syndrome over and over again in the same cave, and then they don't seem to be getting effects from it. So here is the latest map. And just, if you can't see the color, purple, that one dot there is the first confirmed white nose syndrome case in New York. And then blue is 2007-8, lighter blue to 2009-10, then the greens up to the yellows and oranges, and red is 2017. And this is June 7th is when this map came out. And you can see the latest jump was over to Washington State, which is really unnerving to see such a jump. Because now, even these Midwestern states, everybody is swabbing for white nose syndrome because they're just expecting it. So it isn't like, oh, only Washington swabbed and confirmed it, but probably it's already in the middle somewhere. It's possible, but everybody is getting pretty up to date with the same procedures because we all have these cave structures where we know the chances are it could be. And, but then it comes to Washington. So, I mean, we kind of knew that was going to happen, but it's still unnerving, such a large jump.
Do you know where ground zero started? Where it came from?
So, yes, they think it is a Eurasian. And one thought is maybe prior to us ever even studying bats, white nose syndrome worked its way through Europe and we just never knew it wiped out bats because nobody was paying attention to bats, however long ago that could have been, And then somewhere, a caver maybe, the jump over to New York. Or possibly somewhere else, and it just happened to be New York was the first place to find it. But most states are doing similar bat research, so we think that probably was some connection to a cave in Europe, and a person made the jump, because bats don't make that. Unless it's a bat who ends up on a cargo ship and, could have gotten here. I mean, it's possible. One of the two jumps seems to be there's evidence of a very, very, very similar fungus in Europe. And so they think that's where the jump made. But now where it was prior to that, they're still doing a lot of research to try to figure that out.
Is it having similar effect in Europe and Asia?
Right now, it seems to, there are some places where they're starting to see it, but they're still thinking that maybe it already made its way through there because they're not seeing it like we are. So it seems to be that maybe, it's already done its thing through there. The bats now are resistant. They're the ones who came back, like you were saying, from having already been through the... They assume so, but they don't know that for sure.
Is there any research on increased environmental radiation load due to Fukushima and release of highly radioactive material?
I have not heard that. It doesn't mean somebody's not studying it. The nice thing about this, in a weird way, is that because bats eat so many insects, which help farmers out such a great extent, they're eating sometimes their weight in insects a night, a couple of thousand insects a night. The Northeast is seeing an impact on their crops because of the loss of bats. So federally, they're really concerned because agriculture is a big money issue. We all need the food. We all need to take care of the farms. So there has been a lot of, not just in the United States, but internationally, there's been a lot of funding suddenly kind of getting dumped into this research because we are seeing impacts to farms. So it could be that somebody is doing that research. I don't know that for sure. But there is more federal funding than at least I have ever seen for any wildlife-related issue because there's such a detrimental impact. I mean, they have estimated millions of dollars already that we've lost in crops because bats are not at the numbers they need to be to control insects, which means that farmers are either losing crops and or spraying more, which is also expensive. So, yes.
Are there any other mammals that are susceptible to this kind?
So far, no, because the body temperature has to be so low. So even like ground squirrels, their body temperatures do the same. Groundhogs, ground squirrels, their body temperature also drops when they hibernate, but they're not in that humid environment in a cave that's just so good for growing a fungus. So there doesn't seem to be anybody else who's susceptible.
One of the things I'm sitting here looking at, and I'm thinking, all the maps I've looked at that have nuclear power plants pointed out, geez, it's awful interesting. Look at where this started.
Yeah, you know, that I have not seen anyone make that connection yet. And I mean, like I said, there are millions of researchers trying to figure out, you know, where some connection might be. It doesn't mean that's not the case. I have not seen it yet. And they certainly are seeing, I mean, we all know climate change is adjusting a lot of things. You know, insects are coming at the wrong time, and you know, there's lots of things that are making them more susceptible. But nothing that has said, like, this is why white nose syndrome hit here, other than these caves just are perfect breeding zones for the fungus. So, but there is some hope. That is so dreary and depressing. As you mentioned, some species seem to be resistant. And like most things, when you have some terrible disease go through any population and people are exposed to that but then survive it, they build an immunity to it. Maybe they didn't have a complete resistance to it at the beginning, but they build an immunity to it. So there's some thought that that will also happen. You know, we see it in humans as well. And I mentioned the tree bats. We have hoary bats and red bats that are not using caves, and so they're not susceptible to it. Seems to be the case. And I mentioned the smaller numbers that are leveling out in the Northeast. That's a good sign. We also inadvertently, which this is really exciting, because we are getting more funding for bat research, which allows us to do more surveying than we've been able to do in the past, we found new colonies of gray bats roosting in North Carolina, which we never knew we had. We knew we had them move through. We didn't know they roosted here. And they like bridges. And in fact, one of the biologists, one of the bridges, she was surveying for, I think she was out surveying for birds maybe. And she was walking across a bridge on the parkway. And she heard all this chattering and she thought, that sounds like bats. And she went to look at one of the cracks in the bridge, and tons of bats in there. So they set up a survey night, and we set up net bridge so that when they came out, they would get caught and the net could catch them. And they were gray bats and Mexican free-tailed bats, which was pretty awesome because we didn't know they were there. So, and there's 7 of them that we found like that. So that's real exciting. There's also this really cool research that came out. There's a bacteria, this PhD student from Georgia, Georgia State University, was doing research on bananas and agriculturally trying to figure out, he was in an agriculture track, trying to figure out how to not lose so many bananas from over-ripening. They get picked and then brought to grocery stores. And he found this bacteria that seems to slow down the fungal growth on bananas. He heard about white nose syndrome. It was a fungus. He was seeing some good responses to the research he was doing on bananas and said, I wonder if it'll kill this fungus. So they started doing research. Crazy thing, it works. So they have developed this little nebulizer. They took a medical nebulizer and they aerosolized the bacteria through this nebulizer, tested out, in an enclosed setting, a handful of bats, treated them, and released them. Were able to catch them again the next year. No white nose syndrome. So that's great, except you can't go in and just bomb a cave. because what other fungus could you potentially be killing that's really important? Caves are, real unique little microclimates, and there's a lot of species, plant and animal, that live in caves that need that specialized environment, and so you wouldn't want to just go in and wipe out a bunch of, fungus or fungi that you need to be in there. So they can't, and it's also just not practical because caves are not just one room. There's cracks and crevices and 40 tunnels, and so you might just get one section of a cave, but so it doesn't mean it's not going to work. They're just trying to figure out what makes the most sense. But it's nice to see that there's something that seems to be getting control of it. And so some of the projects that are happening in North Carolina, we do Hibernaculum surveys. That is just the coolest word. It sounds so Dracula, But Hibernaculum is just where bats roost in the wintertime. So the caves and mines, etc., are called hibernaculums. And in the wintertime, we don't want to handle the bats. So we're just going in there with a bunch of gear on and trying to look at the bats. We might swab them. They'll identify them, get some counts, but they're not handling them because they're hibernating, so they don't want to wake them up. And the reason that we're in Tyvek suits and all these gloves and tapes is for white nose syndrome protocol, for decontamination protocol. So we don't want to be the ones going in there and getting all these spores all over us. Spores can last forever, and then go into another cave and making it worse. So there's a federal protocol that any researchers, cavers, etc., use to make sure that they'll take all that gear off, clean it with Clorox or professional Lysol and all the equipment that they're using, before they go somewhere else. So that's one of the ways we're learning about them. Radio telemetry is another, and I think I have a picture here in a second where you can see a little radio tracker on the back of a bat. Roost monitoring, a program called NC WRC, which I'll show you in a second, and mist netting. And so this is just another picture. This is a bridge, and she's looking in the cracks of the bridge. Sometimes they'll even set up a bat house on the side of the bridge, and then they can monitor that as well. And so here's some other pictures of going into a cave and being able to check out bats. And so when they're in there, I just mentioned, they're not handling bats, they're just looking at population trends. Are there as many as there were the previous winter, and then doing some swabbing for white nose syndrome. There's a little tracker right there. So they just cut the hair, they can get to the skin, shave a little spot, and glue it on there. It doesn't bother it when it's flying. It eventually falls off. But it allows them to track bats back to roosts, because there are a lot of our bat species that we just don't know where they roost. And it means we can't survey the other bats that we don't know are in that roost. So being able to get one and then track it back lets us find others. And then you can see them releasing it. Bats can't fly from the ground like birds can. They have to be able to drop a little bit and get air under their wings before they fly. So when they're releasing them, you'll always see them release them up high because they need to be able to drop a little bit and get some air under them to fly. And so when they're tracking them, they can find the bats in the roost and learn a little bit about the habitat as well. So here's some other pictures of the roost monitoring. This silo is a roost. If you've ever been to South Mountain State Park, they have 2 of them. You can walk out to see them not far from the visitor center. And Rafinesque's big-eared bats really like those kinds of roosts. Other bats do as well. And so they can go in and survey those bats. And then this is the inside of a bat house. The little chambers are real skinny, less than an inch usually, and they cram up in there and really like those tight spaces. And that's a bat house that she's hanging on the side of a bridge there. And then mist netting. So if you've ever seen bird mist netting, I don't know if you've seen that before, but you basically set up a net in the fly zone, in the corridor where the bats are flying back and forth. And it's hard to see, but this is the net. They might be 12 feet high or so. And there are pockets. This darker spot right here is where the nets kind of overlap and you make a pocket. And that way, if the bat lands on the net but isn't caught, it's not going to fall to the ground. It's going to catch in one of the pockets. And they'll do that on the bird nets as well. And then we are very close by when we set these up. We set them up in the evening. when bats are getting ready to come out, and maybe till 1, 2 in the morning. We stay really close by and then keep checking the nets every few minutes so the bats are not staying in there. And they do get tangled up, but it's a fabric material. It's not like blueberry netting. It's not hard plastic. It's a real fine fabric material. So they might chew on it. Sometimes they chew their way out before we even get to them. I mean, they can chew pretty quickly, but the point is they're not going to get hurt, and then we can get them out.
So what do you do with them?
So when we catch them, we can measure their right forearm. A lot of times we know that there are body parts that can give you an overall estimate of size. And if you can compare that one measurement, you can kind of assume some of the other measurements without having to take tons of measurements, because that just means longer that you're handling the animal. Right forearm is what is standard to measure in bats. And then they will record that information. By the way, you see that little loose tail. For a lot of bats, their tail membrane there, the tail stops at the end, but Mexican free-tail bats, they stick out past it. Big ears, they are cute. It's like wag like a dog, it's really cute. I got a little sidetracked because I'd never seen them before, and this past summer when we found that bridge, I was like, look at their tails, they are so cute. Totally irritated to be in a net, but they are really cute. So they'll measure them. They'll check for wing damage, and that would mean scarred over places, gets a little bit whiter, a kind of different texture, just like us when we form scars, or holes. Sometimes holes get in their wing just if they have run into a limb or something, they can make mistakes and run into stuff. But for the most part, things happen, very rarely, but we're starting to see, because it's tissue, it invades tissue, they just get torn up and it scars over and tears and scars over.
Does the Poole heal?
It does, yeah, and scarred over places, and they're starting to learn lots of ways. Now they're starting to use ultraviolet light when they're surveying the bats, and you can see all kinds of healing over, and then they've got a pretty an indication. Oh, no, you're okay.
Don't use sticky fly tapes because they will
Get caught. That's true. You're exactly right.
happen.
Yeah, no, that would make a lot of sense.
The last picture, they had pretty good gloves on. This is barehanded.
Yeah, it just depends, right? So this is probably an older picture because for a couple of reasons. Part of it is you're not supposed to handle bats barehanded because of being a rabies vector species, and all the biologists have their rabies series, but still. But also now, because of white nose syndrome, we don't want anyone handling bats, and then we could potentially move the spores from the bat. Even though it's in the summertime when we're doing the mist netting, spores last, forever, so you could transfer it, so we try to be really careful. So now what we do is use bat gloves, literally like batting gloves, because they're thin, or gardening gloves, and then put a disposable, latex, non-latex glove over top of it. And then between bats, you change gloves. I mean, it's pretty wasteful, but it at least keeps us from trying to not transmit.
Would you mist spray them every time you catch one?
They're trying to figure that out. I mean, they certainly know they're not going to wipe out this fungus with anything that they come up with, but there may be a way to try and kind of inoculate bats to be tolerant of it and just kind of wait out it running its course. That's what they're trying to figure out. Yeah, because the ones that they have done right now that they released, that's what they did. I mean, they basically individually, but it would be so expensive. I mean, we've caught, right now we're catching just single-digit bats in most sites that we're mist netting, but at times we've caught hundreds. So to be able to do that for everyone would just be an expense we couldn't do yet. But maybe that's something that can be done.
Will all the cruises, tourists, when we go spelunking, do we possibly transmit spores?
Definitely, yep. So they're, the Speleological Society and a lot of the caving groups have either just closed off their caves or are using some similar decontamination procedures to try not and make it worse. Linville Caverns, for example, that's how they make their money. I mean, they can't afford to close, but they do have mats now because most people, they've always encouraged you not touch the cave walls anyway, because we get our junk on a really sensitive climate, habitat. So hopefully they're not touching the sides, but we could get it on our shoes. So you go through these antifungal mats when you go into Linville Caverns, and other places that are public caverns like that do similar stuff, trying not to make it worse. We also band every bat. It's similar to bird bands. They get a number. They're these little very fine aluminum just clamps, they're real light. And they clamp on their forearm, and then everybody gets a number, and then you catch the same bat and you can learn a lot about its health and where it's been and all of that. And then there's some citizen science projects. So this is a new one we just started, roost monitoring. So if you have a bat house or you want to put up a bat house, we would love for you to monitor what you have and how many you have, and is that changing from year to year. All of that data is the data that's going to help us track this better.
Well, I've been tracking the bats in my barn, and the only thing that's killing them are the black snakes. They crawl up and eat them.
They do, it's true.
I went from 40 to 6.
Really?
In 2 years.
Wow, yeah, that's significant.
So what are you going to do with that?
I know, right? And that's just kind of one of those natural things that's harder to control because it's not very easy to control snakes. It's a lot. Yeah, and I'm kind of surprised.
And they attack the nursery every time.
Yeah.
Babies drop to the ground. I've only rehabbed 2 successfully.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible sight.
That's tough. That's very tough. It's true.
You had earlier suggested most all the bats were either cave roosters or tree bats.
Right.
So who's using these houses?
The both. So there are some species in general because when they are using caves, that is usually just for hibernation in the wintertime. Some do during the year, but most of the time that's just nursery colonies or hibernation. And so during the rest of the year, they're hanging out in barns and attics and trees and in bat houses and snags. So
isn't it too cold in a regular barn? Because I don't know where mine go. I don't see them.
Sometimes they just get closer to where food is. So a lot of times they'll move along like water corridors so they can be in and around trees.
They're brown bats.
I
don't know where they hibernate.
Yeah, I mean it could be.
They appear very suddenly on warmer days.
Yeah.
They can't be far.
It's amazing. Some bats, like the red bat, sometimes is down in the leaf litter to hibernate. I mean, it's amazing where they find cracks of bridges, eaves of houses. They'll find any quiet, warm, protected space. I know, isn't it amazing? It's pretty amazing. So we do need help with the roost monitoring. We also have another volunteer program called NC BAMP. It stands for Bat Acoustic Monitoring. And you basically check out a kit. It has a microphone you put on top of your car. You travel a pre-selected route that's 20 miles long at 20 miles an hour because we can't blow the microphone off the car, so we have to go really slow. And it records all the bat calls. And then they get information that looks like this, and they know which bats make calls at which pitches and what pattern, and can tell without having to net them which bats are in the area. So it's pretty awesome. And this is some of the data we get back. So here are the routes we have right now. We try to expand a little bit every year. And we have gotten, for example, the myotis species, which are a couple of different species. It's not perfect yet, always down to a specific species, but sometimes a general group of species. But for example, myotis, these are the bigger the dot and the darker the dot, the more bats that were recorded. And so this is 2011, which was right as that winter ended up getting our first white nose syndrome. So it wasn't intentional, obviously. We just got in the window of maybe being pre-white nose syndrome to starting this program, which is pretty awesome because we didn't have that data, and we're able to possibly have some pre-white nose syndrome data and post. And otherwise we would know what we lost. So being able to say these are our potential numbers, even if it was 1 year, gives us some data that we might not have had. So it was a good window to start in. Yes?
How long does a bat live?
They can be pretty long-lived. I think on average it's 5 or 6 years, but some of them can live, I think, into the 20s. Just depends, yep.
Lucky.
If they're lucky. So you can see that's 2011, this is 2015. So I'll do it again so you can see. And then here's tricolored bats. And there's 2011, and there's 2015. So it's like, it gives you chills. It's pretty scary. But again, it's good data, you know, good or bad, it is beneficial for us to have that kind of data at the large numbers that we're getting, and we could never get those kinds of numbers just from mist netting. So we have to keep expanding that research. So what can you do to help? Last couple of slides. Installing a bat house. The best place to get information on how to set it up is batcon.org, Bat Conservation International. And you can also plant a bat garden. And another great organization, the Organization for Bat Conservation, has a guide on what kind of plants and how you need to set that up. So a couple of slides to show you. Bat houses shouldn't be on trees. Seems kind of ironic because some of them do like to live in trees. But most of the bat species that do use houses are not tree-dwelling ones. There are most of them not tree-dwelling, and when you put it on the side of a tree, snakes and all kinds of things can climb in there, and so they don't like it. Plus there are branches and things around that they can get hung on, so they just don't like houses to be on trees. So at least 24 inches tall and 14 inches wide, 12 feet off the ground. So this is significant. This is a big pole that you're setting up. And each individual chamber needs to be real skinny because they want to be able to stay warm. They don't need drafts around them. So they want to climb in there and rest and stay warm. It needs to be real shallow where you're really building up the body heat. Of course, weather-resistant wood and galvanized screws. And then you want to have a groove somewhere so that there is airflow. And they can make a choice. Do they want to be near the vent or not near the vent? And they can kind of self-regulate in there. You want some sort of landing, so the back of your little skinny bat house needs to be longer, and you need to cut some grooves in it or put some screen on it because they're going to hit that and need to be able to cling to it and crawl up in the house. So you can't have it, you know, just level at the bottom. They have no way to like fly up in there. They need to crawl up in there. So you got to have some sort of landing strip on the back. And this is what the inside looks like. So you can see there's a landing here that's longer on the back side than the front side, and this is a big one. You can see all the bats that climb in there, and there could be hundreds. And you could put them on the side of a house if you know bats are using the eaves anyway, and you're okay with that. As far as guano, the bat poop goes, the only reason that's an issue with histoplasmosis is if it's enclosed. So being outside is not a problem. There's a fungus that grows on the guano, that the off-gassing of that can make you sick. It's a lung issue. But the only way you're going to be exposed to that is if it's in your house over years and years and you're, you know, inhaling that. So outside's totally fine. Great fertilizer, so.
Yeah.
How clear does the area need to be around, or what distance?
It needs to be pretty clear. I mean, you want it out in the open. Because they want to be able to they got to find it, and they want it clear so that they can come out and fly in any direction and they're not going to hit anything. So the more clear you can make it, the better, basically.
I got that house from that conservation group and then started reading about white nose. And you mentioned previously that there were rabies back there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm concerned, do we have them in rabies in North Carolina?
We do, but, and I'll talk about that. As far as white nose syndrome goes, when they are using these in the summertime, chances are bats are interacting with one another anyway. You're not like focusing the risk of white nose syndrome by having a bat house. And it's summertime, so if they're going back to a cave and they're getting those spores on them, they'll lick them off when they come out in the spring, and then because their body's warmed up, and they process that, you know, it's not in their system, and they just get re-exposed the next winter. So using those roosts is okay. As far as rabies vector species goes, and them being around you, you shouldn't handle bats whether you see 100 of them or 2 of them.
Isn't that overrated? They said it's only 1%.
Yeah, we'll talk. Yeah, and we'll talk about that.
That's ridiculous.
It's true, yeah. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second, real quick. And then the last thing is back gardens, and I mentioned this website, so it gives you all kinds of details. I mean, you're basically planting a pollinator garden. It's not anything real significantly different. You want to bring in the bugs, because that's what the bats need. So you're just providing good plants, native plants, that then bring in different types of bugs, and that provides food for the bats. So real quick on rabies, since you mentioned it. The issue with rabies, they are one of the rabies vector species, meaning they can contract rabies. Dogs, cats, raccoons, foxes, yeah, I mean, there are a number of them. The reason bats kind of get more attention is because you're going to know if you're bitten by a dog or a cat or a raccoon or a fox, there's no question. You might not know if you were bitten by a bat. The weird scenario, and it sounds really creepy when I say this, but this is like why it could be a possibility. A bat's tiny, they could potentially climb into your house, right? You're not going to miss a raccoon in your house. But you could potentially have a bat in your house that you didn't know. And it's possible that it could get tripped up in your covers for some reason. You go to sleep, you didn't know you got bitten because they're so tiny, and then you forget. And rabies is fatal, or you just don't know. So rabies is fatal. So what they are trying to do with bats is just let people know if you have had a bat in your house and you can't really say how long it's been there, there could be a tiny possibility that at some point while you were sleeping, you could have gotten bitten by the bat. They're not coming after you, so it's like you'd have to swat at the right time or get tripped up in your covers, or like young kids, if they were playing around with one and they didn't know better, something like that. And then people think, well, I didn't get bitten, so I don't need to report it, or I don't need to call anybody. I'll just let the bat go. That's exactly right. Yeah, if you were to handle a bat and you, even not biting, if you were to get saliva on you, there's a potential for contracting rabies. It wouldn't have to be a bite, but it could be just that connection with saliva. So it would be messing around with one. Don't kiss bats. It's not good to kiss other people that you don't know very well. Go ahead.
On the other side of the equation, what bites bats? What preys on bats?
What preys on bats? Snakes, some owls,
Yes.
Raccoons probably if they could get a hold of them, a dog if they could get a hold of one like on the ground. For the most part, owls and snakes are natural predators for them. I don't know. I know owls do. I can't imagine if they had a chance that they wouldn't. But they're day flyers, so it'd have to be like just catching a one out, like in a tree or something, But I would say because they're just not exactly, the timing is not right, I don't know that they would.
Do most bats spend time on the ground?
Not much. The red bat does do some hibernating in leaf litter as one of the tree bats, but it's not beneficial. Some of them glean off the ground to catch, grasshoppers or fish or mice or something like that, but they're not really crawling around on the ground. The vampire bats have a little bit longer legs, and they're better at crawling because flying and landing on something is a little bit less covert than being able to crawl from the ground up a leg and then just make a scrape and fly off. So they tend to crawl a little bit more, but most don't. Any other questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
Did I see, or did I bring this, years ago, I assumed that bats just fed by catching insects in their mouths. And in this film with very, very slow motion photography, you mentioned how flexible they are with their wings. We're capable of scooping.
Yes, they are.
And
yes.
It's amazing to watch.
If you see some of that footage that's just amazing photography with bats or video footage, often that's Merle Tuttle's work, especially the older stuff. And he was one of the kind of he's a pioneer with bat research and was able to sometimes take bats and put them into rooms that he could be able to get that footage he needed, and started learning what these bats were doing. And yes, they can catch them in the wing, on the wing or tail membrane, and then eat in flight even. Some with their feet can glean, insects off the ground or off a branch or off the water. Yeah, some are catching them, all kinds of different ways in their mouths, yeah. And total side note, but really this is a dork out moment, but it's pretty cool. There are moths who know when they've been pinged by a bat, and they do this like kamikaze dive. They just tuck their wings in and fall really quick to try and avoid getting eaten by the bat. And then there are other moths who send out a like scrambling signal, and it disorients the bat and they can't find them. I mean, how cool is that? In the wildlife world, we're just totally stupid. We think we're so cool, and then you learn what these moths are doing. It's pretty awesome. So yeah, bats are pretty cool.
If you have bats flying around in the evening that you can see, is it worth it then to put up a little house?
Absolutely, yeah.
And is that a southern exposure, or does it matter the exposure?
It'll tell you if you look up on bat conservation. In the South, we're kind of lucky. You don't really have to be too particular about it. In the northern climates where you really have to try to warm up a bat house, they talk to you about like painting them darker and really getting them facing the sun, that sort of stuff. We're kind of lucky. We don't have to work quite as hard at it. But if you're seeing them, you want to kind of put it in their face, it doesn't maybe look pretty, but right up in the middle of wherever they're flying is a great place, because they don't take as easily to it as birds do to birdhouses, so it's a little bit depressing.
For years, they've never gone.
It's depressing, but you have to keep trying. So you might leave it up one way for a year or 2 years. If it seems like they're just not even near it, you might have to try a new spot. That's kind of difficult when you're putting up a 12-foot tall bat house. You're having to probably cement it or get it really, really deep. So I know that is, rough to have to keep moving it. But once they take up to it, you're not just going to get one, you're going to get like 50 or 100. So if it happens, it's a really, really good thing. You just have to kind of wait out not seeing them for a while. Any other questions for me?
When do they mate?
In the fall.
Not when they're in
Usually, yeah, they're coming out to forage for insects, and that's often when they're also mating at the same time. Most of the time. I'm trying to think if there's an exception to that. I don't think so. But in the evening, etc. Thanks for having me.